Hey everyone, before we start today's story, let me ask, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing how far our little storytelling family reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps more people find these stories. Alright, settle in, take a breath, maybe a sip of coffee. Because this one, it surprised even me. It's called My Old Friend's Brother Stopped Me. What he said brought calm. You know how life sometimes catches you between the noise and the quiet when you're rushing through your day, and someone suddenly makes you pause. That's how it happened to me. It was one of those early fall afternoons when the light turns gold and everything feels softer. I'd driven back to my old hometown to visit a friend I hadn't seen in years, Melissa. We'd grown up side by side, shared secrets and heartbreaks, but time had pulled us apart. The drive through the familiar streets made something ache inside me. Every corner looked both new and known, like the town itself had aged with me. Melissa's house sat at the end of a street lined with oak trees. Their leaves had just started to turn, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and the sweet rot of autumn. I parked, checked my reflection in the mirror, why, I'm not sure, and walked up the path. The sound of gravel under my shoes seemed louder than it should have been. When the door opened, it wasn't Melissa standing there. It was her younger brother, Daniel. I almost didn't recognize him. The last time I'd seen him, he was a lanky teenager who followed us around, trying to be funny. Now his face had the lines of a man who'd lived a bit, quiet lines, thoughtful ones. He smiled, and for a moment, it felt like the years folded in on themselves. "You're early," he said, voice calm, easy. Melissa ran to pick up a few things. "She'll be back soon. Come in." Something in his tone made me hesitate. It wasn't discomfort, it was something else. A quiet steadiness that caught me off guard. I stepped inside, and the smell of cinnamon and old books filled the space. The house looked different, but there were traces of the past everywhere. Photos on the mantel, the same creaky floorboard near the hallway. I could almost hear the echoes of our laughter from years ago. We sat in the kitchen. The late light fell through the curtains, painting gold stripes across the counter. He poured coffee for us, just the way I liked it, as if he somehow remembered. Maybe Melissa had told him. Maybe not. For a few minutes, we talked about simple things. Work, weather, how the town had changed. But beneath the small talk, I sensed something else, like a quiet hum beneath the surface. His eyes stayed steady, patient. It wasn't the kind of attention that makes you self-conscious. It was the kind that makes you feel seen, really seen, for the first time in a long while. When I stood up to look at one of the old photos on the wall, Melissa and me at 16, arms around each other, smiling so wide it almost hurt. Daniel spoke. "You always looked out for her," he said softly. "She talks about you a lot. Said you were the one who made her brave." I turned back to him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Life has a way of making you forget the small kindnesses you gave away years ago. Hearing that they mattered, that someone noticed, brought a warmth I hadn't expected. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "She's been through a lot lately," he continued. "Losing Mom hit her harder than she lets on. I think she's trying to keep busy, but you being here, it'll help." The mention of their mother made something in me tighten. I'd been at the funeral, but hadn't stayed long. I'd left before anyone noticed, too afraid of old emotions I wasn't ready to face. "I should have stayed that day," I said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "You came. That's what mattered." There was something in the way he said it. No judgment, no resentment, just a calm acceptance that made the air feel still. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees whispered against the windows. Inside, it felt like time had slowed to a kind of gentle silence. I didn't realize how tightly I'd been holding on to my own guilt until that moment. Guilt for lost years, for unspoken words, for all the ways I'd let the past drift away from me. Then Daniel said something I'll never forget. "You don't always have to fix everything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes just being here is enough." It sounds simple, doesn't it? But those words landed like a weight lifting. Maybe it was the sincerity in his tone, or the calm steadiness in his eyes, but for the first time in a long while, I let myself breathe. Really breathe. Melissa arrived soon after, her laughter filling the house like sunlight. Something inside me had already shifted. The visit I thought would be casual had turned into something deeper, an unexpected stillness I didn't know I'd been craving. Later that night, driving back to the small inn where I was staying, I kept thinking about that moment, how he'd stopped me, how his words had found a quiet place in my heart and stayed there. Sometimes calm doesn't come from silence or solitude. Sometimes it comes from the voice of someone who remembers you differently than you remember yourself. And that's how it began. That night I barely slept, not because of worry, but because my mind kept returning to Daniel's words. The way he'd looked at me, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. There's something disarming about that, especially when you've spent years moving through life half hidden behind what needs to be done, who you're supposed to be. The next morning, I woke to the soft creak of the inn's wooden floors and the smell of coffee drifting from the small breakfast nook downstairs. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Outside, a thin fog hugged the trees. It felt like the world had slowed down for me to think. I decided to visit the lake near the edge of town, the one where Melissa and I used to spend our summers. The road there wound through hills of gold and rust, the trees shimmering in the light. When I parked and stepped out, the air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of pine. The surface of the water was still like glass, and the reflection of the sky looked so perfect that I almost hesitated to disturb it. I sat on the old wooden bench by the shore, running my hand along the worn armrest. The years had smoothed the splinters, but the grooves of old carvings remained, initials, hearts, fragments of names long forgotten. I traced one with my finger and smiled at the memory of a younger version of myself who once believed the world would stay still. I must have sat there longer than I realized because a voice behind me said, "You always came here early." I turned, and there was Daniel again, hands in his jacket pockets, looking both familiar and new. "I didn't think anyone else came here anymore," I said. He smiled faintly. "Not many do, but I saw your car, and I figured you might need some company." We walked along the water's edge, our steps slow, the kind of slow that invites conversation. The sun was rising higher, breaking through the fog, and the lake started to shimmer. "I remember you two out here all the time," he said. "Melissa would come home with mud on her shoes and say it was your fault." I laughed, shaking my head. It probably was. I thought adventure meant getting dirty. "Still do?" he asked, glancing at me. "Maybe not in the same way," I said. "Now it's more about finding peace, not trouble." He nodded. "That's harder to find than adventure." We stopped near the dock, where the boards had grown soft with age. The sound of the water lapping against the wood was steady, rhythmic. For a while, we just stood there. No rush. No need to fill the silence. Then Daniel said quietly, "When Mom passed, I came here every morning. I didn't talk to anyone about it, just sat here. It was the only place I could hear myself think." There was no tremor in his voice, but there was weight. The kind of weight that comes from holding something too long. I looked at him and said, "I wish I'd stayed that day. I could have helped." He shook his head. "You're here now. Sometimes that matters more." Those words again, simple, grounding. They found their way into the quiet space inside me where regret had been sitting for years. We sat on the edge of the dock, feet dangling over the water. A heron glided across the lake, its wings barely touching the surface. It reminded me how life at its best feels balanced, like floating between motion and stillness. Daniel turned slightly toward me. You know, Melissa told me once that she always felt braver when you were around. She said you had this way of making things seem possible. I smiled at that, though it hurt a little. I don't know if that's true anymore. Maybe it's not about being brave all the time, he said. Maybe it's about remembering that you were once, and that it's still somewhere in you. Something in his voice, steady, sincere, brought that same sense of calm I'd felt the day before. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about recognition. He wasn't trying to fix me. He was simply there, offering space for me to breathe. When we finally stood to leave, the air had warmed. The light shimmered on the water, and I felt a small shift inside me, like something had settled. As I walked back to my car, Daniel stopped me again. Hey, he said, come by tonight. Melissa's having a few people over. Old faces. It'll be good for her, and maybe for you too. I hesitated. I'd avoided gatherings for years. Too many memories, too many what-ifs. But something about his tone made it impossible to say no. All right, I said. I'll come. He smiled, that quiet kind of smile that doesn't need much explanation. Good. She'll be happy. So will I. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Daniel stood by the lake, hands in his pockets, looking out over the water. The image stayed with me long after the trees swallowed the road ahead. I didn't know it then, but that evening would open another door, one I hadn't realized was still closed. When I arrived at Melissa's later that night, the sun had just set. The porch light cast a warm circle on the front steps, and laughter spilled softly from inside. The smell of home cooking drifted through the air, roasted vegetables, something sweet baking in the oven. For a moment I stood at the door, hand hovering near the bell, caught between comfort and hesitation. Melissa answered before I knocked. She looked just the same, familiar and bright-eyed, though there were faint shadows beneath them now. We hugged, the kind of embrace that holds both joy and apology for lost time. Look at you, she said with a grin. You haven't changed a bit. I laughed. You need better glasses, Mel. Inside, the house was warm and alive. A few of our old friends were already gathered in the living room, voices overlapping in that easy rhythm of shared history. Photos lined the walls, family vacations, birthdays, moments frozen in time. It was comforting and bittersweet all at once. Daniel was by the fireplace, setting down a tray of glasses. He looked up when I walked in, that same quiet steadiness in his expression. Our eyes met for a second longer than necessary, and I felt the familiar calm return, grounding me amid the noise and nostalgia. Melissa waved me over to sit beside her. You remember everyone, she said, pointing around the room. Faces I hadn't seen in years smiled back at me, some softer, some older, but all familiar. The conversation flowed easily, like slipping back into a well-worn coat. For a while, I let myself just listen. The room glowed in the soft lamplight, filled with the sound of old stories and gentle teasing. It felt like stepping back into a part of my life I'd quietly tucked away. When the evening settled and most people drifted to the kitchen for dessert, I found myself near the back porch. The door was open, and the cool night air carried the smell of damp leaves and faraway wood smoke. Daniel was out there, leaning against the railing, looking up at the sky. I joined him, resting my arms on the wooden edge beside his. The night was clear, and the stars shimmered faintly through the branches. Quiet out here, I said. He nodded. Sometimes that's the best part. For a while, neither of us spoke. The crickets filled the silence, steady and soft. Then he said, You ever think about how fast time goes? One day you're looking ahead, and the next you're trying to look back and find where it all went. I smiled faintly. Lately, I think about that more than I should. He looked at me then, not in pity, but understanding. You've been carrying a lot, haven't you? I hesitated, surprised by how direct he was, but there was no judgment in his tone, just a kind of quiet curiosity. I guess I've been busy surviving, I admitted. Work, family, just keeping things together. I didn't notice how much of myself I left behind until I came here. Daniel nodded slowly. That's what happens when life keeps asking for more than it gives back. You start running on empty. His words sat between us for a while, and something about the truth of them made my throat tighten. Do you ever wish you could start over? I asked. He took a breath, looking out into the dark. Not start over. Just pause. Take stock of what still matters. There was something so steady in the way he said it that I found myself doing exactly that. Pausing. Thinking. Feeling the night air against my skin, the faint creak of the porch boards beneath our feet, the shared silence that didn't demand anything. After a while, Melissa stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of tea. You two look like philosophers, she teased, handing one to me. Daniel chuckled, just catching up. She smiled at us both. I'm glad you're here, she said to me quietly, and for a second, her voice softened. I've missed having someone who remembers the old days. I reached out and squeezed her hand. I've missed them too. Maybe it's time we stop remembering and start rebuilding. Her eyes brightened, and she nodded. I'd like that. Later, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, I helped Melissa clear the dishes. The simple rhythm of washing and drying felt strangely comforting. She hummed softly, an old tune I recognized from our teenage years. When I left, Daniel walked me to my car. The street was lined with shadows, the oaks above us whispering in the wind. Thanks for coming, he said. It meant a lot to her, and to me. I should be the one thanking you, I replied. It's been a long time since I felt still. He gave that small, thoughtful smile again. Stillness doesn't mean stopping. It just means you've found the right place to rest for a while. I didn't quite know what to say, so I just nodded. Before I drove off, I looked at him one more time in the rearview mirror. He stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in his pockets, the porch light catching his face. There was a quiet certainty about him, something that made the world feel a little steadier. As I turned onto the main road, I realized that calm wasn't something he'd given me. It was something he'd reminded me how to find. That night, back at the inn, I opened the window to let the cool air in. The town lights shimmered in the distance, and for the first time in years, I felt a soft kind of peace, a beginning, not an ending. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air in the room felt crisp, the kind that carries quiet promises. I made a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the first light spill over the rooftops. The town looked softer in the early glow, like a painting from another time. I realized that I didn't want to rush home, not yet. There was something unfinished, something I still needed to understand. After breakfast, I decided to stop by the old park on the edge of town. The benches there were new, but the trees were the same ones that had watched us grow up. I walked the familiar path, listening to the sound of leaves crunching beneath my shoes. Each step felt like a conversation with the past. I sat on a bench overlooking the small pond. Ducks glided across the water, their ripples catching the sunlight. The stillness of it all reminded me of that first moment when Daniel stopped me, the calm he brought into a noisy part of my life. A little while later, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Couldn't sleep either? Daniel's voice was warm, easy. Not really, I said, smiling. Something about being here makes my mind restless, but in a good way. He sat beside me, his hands loosely folded. For a moment, we just watched the water. The quiet between us had grown comfortable, like an old friendship rediscovered. He said, "Melissa told me you might head back today." I was thinking about it, I admitted, but I'm not sure I'm ready to leave yet. He nodded, eyes still on the pond. You know, sometimes we come back to places thinking we'll find what we lost. But what we really find is a part of ourselves we left behind. The truth of that sat deep in my chest. I thought about how much of myself I'd put aside over the years. Pieces of courage, laughter, hope. Somehow, just being here had stirred them awake again. We talked for a long while. About family, about change, about how life rarely goes as planned, but somehow still manages to move us forward. There was no rush in his words, no pressure, just the kind of conversation that lets you breathe a little easier. Eventually, we stood and started walking toward the old footbridge that crossed the creek. The boards creaked beneath our steps, and sunlight filtered through the branches overhead. I paused halfway across, looking down at the water swirling below. "You know," I said, "I think I came here expecting everything to feel smaller. But it doesn't. It feels just right." Daniel smiled softly. "Maybe because you're seeing it with clear eyes now." I turned to look at him, and in that moment, I understood something important. It wasn't the town that had changed. It was me. For so long, I'd been carrying the noise of life, the worries, the expectations, the constant motion. But calm had a different sound. It was slower, deeper, found in quiet moments like this. He looked at me with that same steady expression and said, "You've got a lot of strength in you. You just forgot where to look for it." I didn't know how to respond at first. His words sank in slowly, like sunlight warming cold ground. "Thank you," I finally said, "for reminding me." He shook his head gently. "You reminded yourself. I just happened to be here." We walked back to the parking lot, our steps unhurried. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and the promise of change. Before I got into my car, he reached out, resting his hand lightly on the door. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and don't wait another decade to visit." I laughed softly. "I won't. Next time, coffee's on me." He smiled that quiet, knowing smile of his. "I'll hold you to that." As I drove away, the road stretched out ahead of me, framed by golden trees. The town slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the feeling it gave me stayed. It wasn't nostalgia. It was peace. For a long time, I'd thought calm was something you earned after the noise faded. But now I understood. It's something you can find even in the middle of change, if you let yourself stop long enough to feel it. When I got home that evening, I didn't rush to unpack. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the sky turn from gold to blue. Everything looked the same, but I didn't. Sometimes life gives you people who remind you of who you were, and sometimes, if you're lucky, they help you see who you still can be. That's what Daniel did for me. He didn't just bring calm into my life, he reminded me how to carry it forward. And that, quiet, simple, and unexpected, is how peace found its way back home. Thank you for listening to this story. Tell me in the comments what moment in your life brought you unexpected calm, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.